welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a really crucial topic, maybe a bit sobering, but absolutely essential if you want to understand modern warfare and, frankly, the future readiness of our military forces. We're talking about reconstitution operations.
Yeah, and this isn't just about, getting more bullets and beans to the front. It's much bigger than that.
Right. It's about how senior commanders fundamentally rebuild their units, their combat power. We're talking people, equipment, and maybe most importantly, that unit cohesion during a really grinding attritional conflict.
It really is the ultimate test, I think, of a nation's strategic depth, its combat endurance. For the last 20 years or so, the focus was heavily on counterinsurgency, regional stuff. Now we're shifting back institutionally towards thinking about large-scale combat operations. And that means, it means accepting the possibility of truly catastrophic losses. Personnel, equipment, on a scale we haven't planned for in decades.
So if you can't rebuild units quickly, effectively, you lose.
Well, you lose the ability to keep the initiative, absolutely. And in a long fight, a protracted conflict, that means you eventually lose the war. Simple as that.
Okay, so that sets our mission today. We want to go beyond just defining the term. We want to understand how modern war really forces a new way of thinking about rebuilding combat power.
And to do that, we're mainly looking at two key sources today. First, there's the foundational doctrine, the official Army Techniques publication 394.4. It's specifically on reconstitution operations, published back in May 2021.
Right, the baseline. And what's the second source?
We're contrasting that doctrine with a really fascinating analysis. It's an article called Lessons in Reconstitution from the Russia-Ukraine War. And this piece, it proposes something pretty provocative, a new framework they call transformative reconstitution.
Transformative reconstitution. Okay, we'll definitely dig into that. But what both of these sources really hammer home, it sounds like, is just the sheer intensity of large-scale combat. The losses are huge.
They are, far beyond anything the Army's dealt with in generations. So that ability to take those hits, those devastating losses, and then rapidly rebuild your units to reconstitute that becomes, probably the key variable for lasting in a fight and ultimately winning.
Okay, so let's start with that baseline. The official doctrine, Army Techniques publication 394.4. How does it actually define reconstitution?
The definition is quite specific. It's an operation that commanders plan and implement to restore units to a desired level of combat effectiveness commensurate with mission requirements and available resources.
In operation, that word seems key. It sounds like prioritizing resources maybe across a whole theater, meaning somebody else is taking risks so this one unit can get rebuilt.
That's a big part of it, yes. And you picked up on a crucial point. The doctrine is very careful to distinguish this from just normal everyday sustainment.
How so? Sustainment is keeping the lights on, right? Fuel, ammo, food.
Exactly. Sustainment is continuous. It's routine logistics, fuel, food, basic maintenance, keeping things going day to day. Reconstitution, though, goes way beyond that. It's a deliberate, formal operation.
Okay.
That means it gets planning resources, command attention, usually reserved for, major offensive actions. It's typically directed from higher up, usually 2 levels of command above the unit that's taken the losses.
2 levels, so we're talking corps level, maybe higher.
That's right. And it needs significant external support. Resources have to be pulled from somewhere else, reallocated. That's far beyond what normal sustainment channels handle. When a unit enters reconstitution, it means a very senior leader has made a high-stakes call to prioritize that unit's survival, potentially taking assets away from other important missions.
Wow. Okay, so it's a massive undertaking. And the doctrine breaks this big operation down into, 3 main parts?
Correct. 3 essential elements, usually sequential. First is assessment, then comes reorganization, and finally regeneration.
Let's unpack those. Assessment sounds pretty critical. That's where you figure out if the unit is even worth saving, or if it's too far gone.
That's the hard reality, yes. Assessment is fundamentally the commander trying to figure out the unit's actual ability to do its mission, or maybe a future mission. The doctrine talks about 2 types here. There's the internal assessment.
Internal, done by the unit itself.
Yes, it's continual, done by the unit commander. And it includes those really important but sometimes hard to measure things like morale, how effective the remaining leaders are, the discipline of the troops still fighting, the intangibles.
But you can't just rely on gut feelings in a war, I imagine. There has to be something more objective for the higher-ups.
Absolutely. That's the external assessment.
Yeah.
It's formal, directed by the higher headquarters. Often, there's a specialized team, maybe called a Regeneration Task Force, that comes in and does a really detailed, objective look.
And they provide the hard data. the numbers.
Exactly. They give the objective metrics needed to justify committing those huge external resources we were just talking about.
Yeah.
You need proof it's worth the investment.
And those objective metrics, the key ones for the big planning process, those are the A ratings, right? Based on personnel and equipment levels.
That's right. Assigned mission manning, or AMM, and assigned mission equipping, AME. These are like the institutional dashboard warning lights.
How do they work? Is it like a grade?
Sort of. The Army uses a 4-level system. Level 1 is the best you've got 90% or more of the people and gear you're supposed to have. Level 2 and 3 are progressively worse. Yeah. But the one you really need to pay attention to is level 4.
A4, what does that signify?
An A4 rating means the unit is below 70% of its required manning, or below 65% of its required equipment. Strategically, that's seen as the point where it's really combat ineffective for its current mission. Units hitting A4 are immediate candidates for either a massive regeneration effort or
the really tough decision.
Or full redistribution, basically being broken up.
What's the real impact of getting slapped with an A4 rating? It's not just note in a file, is it?
Oh, definitely not. It carries enormous weight institutionally. An A4 often triggers mandatory notifications way up the chain of command, sometimes even to political leadership, maybe Congress, depending on the unit. It signals a major strategic setback.
Wow.
It activates immediate resource arguments. Yeah. Why it matters so much is it formalizes the fact that this unit, which maybe took decades and millions to build, just cannot function right now without massive directed intervention.
Okay, so assessment happens. Let's say the unit is deemed salvageable. Next step is reorganization. This sounds like the unit trying to help itself first.
That's the core idea, yeah. Reorganization is all about measures the commander takes internally, using whatever resources are immediately available, stuff left in their own supply stocks, parts they can maybe cannibalize from damaged vehicles, just to maintain some level of combat effectiveness.
So it's making do.
It's making do. The doctrine is clear. This usually won't significantly increase combat power, but it maximizes what you do have left, the remaining people and gear and leaders.
And the doctrine splits this into immediate and deliberate reorganization. What's the difference there? Is it just about speed?
It's mostly about time and how close the enemy is. Immediate reorganization is quick, it's temporary, it happens right there on the objective, maybe right after a fight. Consolidating surviving squads, pulling ammo from a knockout vehicle to one that's still running, maybe shifting a sergeant whose platoon got hit hard to lead another one that lost its leader.
Okay, battlefield triage, basically.
Pretty much. Deliberate reorganization happens a bit further back from the front lines. Similar kinds of actions, cross-leveling people and gear, but you have a little more time for basic resupply, maybe some quick maintenance. Still mainly using internal resources, though. The enemy pressure really dictates how deliberate you can be.
So reorganization keeps the unit in the fight, maybe just barely. But regeneration, that sounds like the real fix. That's when the outside help arrives.
Exactly right. Regeneration is the big rebuild. This is where the external replacements flow in personnel, equipment, major supplies. It involves getting command and control working again, and critically, conducting mission-essential training.
Training seems key there.
It's vital. And because regeneration is so resource-heavy, it usually happens under the control of corps level or higher. And this is a critical principle in the doctrine. It must happen out of contact with the enemy.
Why out of contact? Can't they do it closer to the fight?
If you try to regenerate while actively fighting, you're just pouring precious resources, new people, new tanks, straight into the meat grinder. You lose them before they're properly integrated or effective. You need time and space away from direct enemy fire to do it right.
Makes sense. Now, the doctrine offers 2 ways to do regeneration. This seems really strategic because it affects how the unit actually gets put back together. Talk about the difference between incremental and sub-unit regeneration.
Yeah, this is a really important distinction. Incremental regeneration is kind of what you might first think of. It focuses on replacing individual losses across the unit. You lost 5 soldiers spread across 3 platoons. Okay, you get 5 individual replacements plugged into those holes.
Sounds straightforward, but what's the catch?
The catch is integration time and leadership drain. These replacements are often brand new recruits, or maybe people cross-leveled from non-combat roles. They don't know the unit, the tactics, the remaining veterans.
Right.
And this often forces the experienced veterans left into new, higher roles they might not be trained for. Like a good platoon sergeant suddenly has become the platoon leader because the lieutenant was killed. So now you have multiple small teams across the whole unit, all trying to integrate new people and new leaders at the same time. It takes a lot of time and effort to get everyone working together smoothly again.
Okay, so incremental is replacing piece by piece. Subunit regeneration sounds different, maybe more drastic.
It is more drastic up front, but potentially faster in achieving real cohesion. With subunit regeneration, the commander takes the remaining veteran personnel and consolidates them into fewer, but hopefully more complete formations.
Consolidates them, so it merges platoons or something?
Exactly. Then the unit receives a complete, trained subordinate formation from an external source to fill the gap. Let's use that tank company example from the doctrine. Say a company lost 4 tanks, maybe 1 from platoon A, 2 from B, 1 from C.
Okay. Under incremental, they'd get 4 separate replacement tanks and crews
Right.
and have to integrate them into those 3 different platoons.
Right. Lots of small integration tasks. But under subunit regeneration, the company commander might take all the remaining good tanks and crews and consolidate them into just 2 strong platoons, say platoon A and platoon B. Then, the company receives an entire 3rd platoon, platoon C, complete with its own trained leader, platoon sergeant, tanks, crews, as a single cohesive package from outside the unit.
Ah, I see. So you get a whole working piece already trained together.
Precisely. This method concentrates your remaining experienced leaders in the existing platoons, and it drastically cuts down the integration challenge. You're mainly integrating one new platoon into the company, rather than lots of individuals into multiple broken teams. That new platoon is already internally cohesive. The veterans just need to learn to work with the new platoon as a whole.
That makes a lot of sense tactically. Okay, last piece of the doctrine puzzle. Redistribution. This sounds like the absolute worst case scenario.
It is. It's the strategic equivalent of saying, we can't save this unit.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly difficult, frankly heart-wrenching decision for a senior commander. Redistribution means taking a severely attrition unit's remaining people and equipment and assigning them out to other units or commands. They might go as individual replacements or maybe as small functioning teams, but the parent unit essentially ceases to exist.
When does this happen? Is there a threshold?
The doctrine suggests it's typically considered when a unit suffers losses greater than 50%. The calculation is brutal. Do you spend scarce resources trying to regenerate this one unit that's almost gone? Or could you use those same resources to bring 2 or 3 other damaged units back up to strength more quickly?
That's a grim calculation. What are the deeper costs of making that call, beyond just losing the numbers?
Oh, the costs are huge, organizationally and culturally. When a unit is redistributed, it's effectively dissolved, at least for the duration of the conflict. It loses its unit colors, its historical lineage, the connection soldiers have to his battle honors and legacy.
That history matters a lot to soldiers.
Immensely. And this decision is incredibly hard to reverse mid-conflict. It has radical long-term impacts on force structure planning after the war. This is truly where senior leaders accept the highest level of organizational risk, and frankly political risk too. They know the deep cultural wound they're inflicting by dissolving a unit with history.
Okay, that gives us a solid grasp of the official U.S. Army doctrine. Now let's shift gears and look at how this plays out in the real world using that analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war. This conflict really provides a stark, frankly horrifying look at what happens when Reconstitution goes wrong under intense pressure.
It really does. The numbers coming out of that conflict are just staggering. They underscore the kind of attrition the U.S. military needs to be prepared for in large-scale combat operations. The analysis we read mentioned that as of mid-2024, Russia was averaging something like 645 casualties per day.
Per day. That's like losing an entire battalion every single day.
Every day. And it accelerated at times. In May 2024, it was reportedly over 1,200 casualties a day. Equipment losses are just as bad. Think about losing roughly 18 artillery systems per day. The scale is immense.
Almost unimaginable, yet despite bleeding like that, the analysis points out Russia's actually shown a terrifying ability to just keep feeding the machine, right, in terms of sheer numbers.
They have. They've demonstrated a kind of grim success in quantity-focused reconstitution. They've been surprisingly effective at just refilling the ranks. The analysis noted they grew their troop strength inside Ukraine from around 360,000 to 470,000 between 2023 and 2024, despite those massive losses.
How? Where are they getting the bodies?
Mobilization, volunteers attracted by high pay, pulling troops from other areas, recruiting prisoners, a whole range of methods focused purely on getting numbers to the front.
And what about equipment?
Their material regeneration, just in terms of volume, is also pretty impressive, maybe disturbingly so. They're reportedly on track to produce or refurbish over 1,200 main battle tanks a year, and they're churning out at least 3 million artillery shells or rockets annually.
3 million shells. That's more than all the NATO allies combined, isn't it?
That's what the analysis stated, yes.
Yeah.
More than all 32 North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies put together. So purely on a quantity basis, they're managing to replace losses at a significant scale.
Okay, so if they're winning the numbers game, replacing losses, keeping troop levels up, where's the fatal flaw? What's the big problem the analysis highlights in Russia's approach?
The flaw is what the analysis calls the efficacy dilemma. It's this devastating decline in quality that cripples their actual combat power, even as the numbers look okay on paper.
Efficacy dilemma, meaning they have bodies, but they can't fight effectively.
Precisely. Russia's Reconstitution model seems fundamentally focused on just balancing supply and demand over time. They view personnel almost like a commodity, something disposable you just need to replace. This relentless focus on volume, on attrition, leads directly to a steady decline in the actual effectiveness, the quality of their forces.
And the analysis described this as a kind of self-reinforcing cycle of failure, didn't it? Can you walk us through that? It seems like the core warning here.
Yeah, it's a really vicious downward spiral. It starts, the analysis argues, with this underlying institutional belief, maybe unspoken but clear in practice, that troops are disposable.
Okay, step 1. Value troops lowly.
Step 2. That mentality directly results in poor quality forces. They get minimal training, they lack professionalism, maybe leadership is weak. This naturally leads to tactical incompetence on the front lines.
Makes sense. Poorly trained troops fight poorly.
Step 3. But commanders, they're still under immense pressure from Moscow to get results, to take ground, to show something.
Right. The political pressure doesn't go away.
So, step 4. Facing pressure and having incompetent troops, commanders resort to the only tactics that seem to work, however crudely tactics that completely disregard human life. Things like those mass frontal assaults, human wave attacks.
Which then just reinforces the initial idea that troops are disposable because you're using them that way.
Exactly. It closes the loop. They get locked into this cycle where the only tactic that yields even minimal results is the one that costs the most lives and requires the least skill, which further justifies not investing in training or quality because, hey, they're just going to die anyway. It's a horrific feedback loop.
And the sources gave some pretty gruesome examples of this in action.
They did. Look at the fight for Bakhmut, which lasted almost a year from 2022 into 2023. Russia reportedly lost over 10,000 soldiers killed there, often in exactly those kinds of mass frontal attacks against well-prepared Ukrainian defenses.
And for what? Tiny gains, right?
Minuscule territorial gains. But those human wave tactics, often led by Wagner convicts initially, became the only method that seemed to produce any forward movement at all for their low-quality, quickly reconstituted forces. So the tactic, despite its horror, got validated in their system.
And this wasn't just an early war problem, it continued.
Absolutely. That shows the organizational learning process is broken. The analysis points to the attack near Ubanska in March 2024. This was a battalion-sized armored assault, 36 tanks, 12 armored personnel carriers. A significant force.
Okay, sounds like a proper combined arms attack.
It should have been, but they launched it in broad daylight across open fields, basically following a main road. And crucially, the analysis highlighted they were unable to coordinate effectively. No working very high-frequency tactical radio network.
No radios. In a tank assault, how did they coordinate?
They didn't effectively. Without reliable comms, they couldn't coordinate the tanks with infantry support or call in artillery fire accurately or coordinate air defense. It devolved into a deadly game of follow the leader.
What happened?
The lead vehicle got hit, probably by mines or anti-tank missiles, and the whole formation just fell apart. Chaos.
Yeah.
They lost 12 to 15 tanks in that single failed attack, including some of their more modern T-90Ms, all because the reconstituted crews and commanders lacked the training, the cohesion, the basic ability to execute even moderately complex combined arms operations.
So the poor reconstitution leads directly to tactical failure.
Directly. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense even commented that the Russian army seems to be defaulting to these crude, costly attacks precisely because their reconstituted units have such minimal training and poor integration. That's all they can do.
Beyond the failures with personnel, the analysis also points to a decline in the quality of their equipment, right? Showing the long-term cost of this attrition model.
That's the other side of the efficacy dilemma coin, yes. It's not just the soldiers. The gear is degrading too. Russia has apparently burned through most of its stockpiles of its best, most modern tanks, like the T-80s and T-90s they had before the war.
So what are they using now?
They're pulling older and older stuff out of deep storage. The analysis projects, they'll face deep depletion of their massive Soviet-era stocks by maybe 2026. This forces them to rely increasingly on much older models, T-62s, even T-55s. These are tanks designed in the 1950s and 60s.
Wow. So even though they're producing or refurbishing a lot of tanks numerically, the average quality is dropping significantly.
Steadily dropping. They can churn out quantity, but the qualitative effectiveness of those replacements, both the people and the machines, is going down. And that declining quality, well, it forces them back into relying on even more simplistic, costly tactics on the battlefield, which just reinforces that whole vicious cycle we talked about.
Okay, this really highlights the danger. It brings us back then to our own doctrine, the Army Techniques Publication 394.4. The big question is the U.S. system fundamentally set up to avoid that Russian efficacy dilemma? Do we have the right approach?
Well, there's definitely a major strength in the U.S. doctrine that seems absent in the Russian model we just discussed. Our doctrine explicitly, repeatedly emphasizes that mission-essential training is a critical part of reconstitution.
Right. We mentioned that reorganization and regeneration aren't complete until training happens.
Exactly. Training to restore cohesion, proficiency on equipment, tactical competence. That's a deliberate, stated requirement, which seems like a world away from the Russian approach of just plugging bodies into holes. It shows an institutional focus on the value of the individual soldier and the team.
And the doctrine is proactive too, right? It makes planning for this part of the process.
Yes. It requires commanders and staff to develop a reconstitution plan as a branch or sequel during formal planning, like the military decision-making process. You're supposed to think about it before you take heavy losses. So those are definite strengths.
Okay, but there's always a but, isn't there? The analysis we read raised a concern, what it called the mirror problem. What's that about?
The mirror problem is the uncomfortable suggestion that, despite emphasizing training, the core logic of the U.S. doctrine might still be, well, a bit too similar to the Russian model underneath. That it's still fundamentally focused on balancing the supply of people and gear against the demand created by losses over time.
So the argument is it's basically just Russia's model, but add training and try not to treat people as disposable. Is that fair?
That's the provocative critique offered in the analysis, yeah. The concern is that while the intent is much better, the underlying framework might still be too focused on quantitative replacement and might not fully grapple with the qualitative challenges of protracted high-intensity war and the need for rapid adaptation.
And the doctrine itself acknowledges some pretty huge challenges, inherent difficulties in doing this, even with the best intentions. What are those big limiting factors?
Oh, absolutely. The doctrine is realistic about the hurdles. First and foremost is something called talent replacement. It's incredibly hard, maybe impossible, to quickly replace combat-experienced leaders and specialized personnel.
You can't just create a seasoned platoon sergeant overnight.
Exactly. The doctrine even cites the experience from World War II, where a typical U.S. fighting division in Europe might experience 200 to 300% personnel turnover in a single year of heavy combat.
2 to 3 times the unit's entire strength cycling through in a year.
That's the level of churn. You can replace the bodies relatively quickly through the replacement system, but you can't replace that accumulated combat experience, that leadership intuition, that unit trust built over time. Rebuilding that proficiency takes time, serious time.
Okay, so replacing talent is hard. What else?
Then there's the challenge of material replacement, specifically what the doctrine calls non-like replacement items.
Meaning you don't always get back the same piece of equipment you lost.
Right. In a long, intense war, the industrial base struggles to keep up. Production lines might be slow, or maybe they're building newer models, but you still have stocks of older stuff. So a unit might lose a modern M1A2 Abrams tank, but get an older M1A1, or maybe even an M60 if things got really bad, hypothetically.
And that creates problems.
Huge problems, cascading problems. Operators might be unfamiliar with the older systems, the controls are different, the sights are different, the mechanics, the sustainers, they struggle too. The older gear needs different repair parts, different manuals, different diagnostic tools, maybe even different fuel or ammo types. All that complexity just slows down the whole regeneration process, adds friction, creates risk everywhere.
Talent, equipment. What's the biggest constraint of all?
Time. It always comes down to time. It's the ultimate trade-off. Commanders are constantly caught in this bind. Balancing the time needed to do regeneration, properly comprehensive rebuilding, thorough training, integration, which can take weeks, maybe months, for big units, against the urgent pressure from the battlefield.
The need for combat power now.
Right. The enemy isn't waiting for you to finish your training cycle. If you take too long, you might cede the initiative, lose critical ground, maybe even lose the war. But if you rush it, you send unprepared units back into the fight, potentially wasting those precious resources and lives. That agonizing choice between speed and quality is the absolute core of risk management in protracted war.
And to really drive home why taking that time for training is so vital, the Army Techniques publication uses a fantastic historical example, doesn't it? The 7th Armored Division in the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes, it's a perfect case study. Really validates the core principle of the U.S. doctrine. December 1944, Battle of the Bulge. The 7th Armored had fought a really tough delaying action helping to blunt the German offensive near St. Vith, but they paid a heavy price.
How bad were the losses?
Devastating. They lost something like 40% of their tanks, 10% of their personnel killed, wounded, or captured. The division was exhausted, battered, arguably combat ineffective at that moment.
And the replacements they got, they weren't exactly experienced tankers or infantrymen, were they?
Not at all. The replacements were a real mixed bag. Brand new inductees, fresh from the States, former anti-aircraft artillerymen whose units were being broken up, even cooks and clerks retrained hastily as infantrymen. They were bodies, yes, but they weren't a cohesive, trained fighting force.
So what did the commander do, Brigadier General Hasbrouck, right? Did he just throw them back into the line to plug gaps?
That would have been the easy, perhaps tempting thing to do given the pressure. But Hasbrouck made a different, much harder decision. He committed the division to a deliberate reconstitution period. He pulled them out of contact with the enemy and prioritized 3 weeks purely for training and reorganization.
3 weeks. In the middle of the Bulge. That's a bold move. What kind of training did they do?
It was intense and, crucially, focused on the fundamentals at the lowest levels. Things like platoon gunnery for the replacement tank crews, small unit infiltration drills for the new infantrymen. They formed small combined arms task forces, maybe a few tanks, some infantry, engineers, and practice working together at that small team level, rebuilding cohesion from the ground up.
And did it work? Was taking that time worth it?
Spectacularly so. When the 7th Armored went back on the offensive in January 1945, this reconstituted division, the one built on those inexperienced replacements, but now properly trained and integrated, they recaptured all the ground they had previously lost near St. Vith in just 3 days.
Wow, 3 days.
It was a stunning success. It absolutely proved that taking the time for quality reconstitution, focusing on training and cohesion even under pressure, provides a decisive edge. It generates real combat power, not just numbers. It's a historical validation for why training must be part of the process.
That parallel, the shock of heavy losses, the need to pull back, rebuild, and then counterattack, it sounds a lot like the dynamics we've seen in Ukraine, or even going back to the Korean War.
Very similar dynamics. Protracted conflicts often follow that pattern, and the lesson seems consistent. The side that can better anticipate that shift, the side that masters the transition to protracted war and executes effective reconstitution first, often gains the decisive long-term advantage.
Which brings us back to the analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war and its conclusion, that the U.S. needs something more than just replacing losses plus training. We need an approach that gives us an asymmetric advantage, avoids that qualitative decline we saw with Russia, and doesn't rely on waiting years for industry to catch up.
Exactly. We need a system designed not just to endure attrition, but to actually improve and adapt during the fight.
And that's where this idea of transformative reconstitution comes back in. The analysis proposes this as the way to get that asymmetric advantage. It argues that just plugging holes, even with training, isn't enough. We need to fundamentally redesign how we approach rebuilding now, so we can adapt during a conflict, not just recover what we lost.
That's the core idea. It's about moving beyond just replacement and aiming for actual transformation of the force during protraction. The current U.S. doctrine, as we discussed, really focuses heavily on 3 elements: training, material, and personnel.
Right, TMP.
Transformative reconstitution argues that too narrow. It says we need to integrate changes across the entire force development framework. You might have heard the acronym DOTMLPFP.
Doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership and education, personnel, facilities, and policy.
The whole shebang.
The whole shebang. Transformative reconstitution says you have to be thinking about and potentially changing all of those elements during reconstitution, not just swapping out people and tanks and running some drills. Why is hitting all 8 of those necessary? Why isn't just focusing on the people, gear, and training enough if we do it well?
Because focusing only on those risks falling into what the analysis calls the adaptation trap.
The adaptation trap, that's what happened to Russia, right? Adapting backward?
Exactly. They adapted, yes, but they adapted backwards. They fell back on simpler, cruder tactics like human wave attacks,
Right.
tactics that the enemy, in this case Ukraine with Western support,
Yeah.
had already figured out how to counter effectively. Transformative reconstitution demands adapting forward.
Adapting forward, meaning?
Meaning hitting the enemy with something new. A new way of fighting, maybe new organizational structures, enabled by updated doctrine and leadership approaches that the enemy hasn't adapted to yet. It's about staying ahead of the enemy's learning curve during the war itself. And you can't realistically change your doctrine without also ensuring you have the right facilities to train it, or the right policy changes to support the new structure, or the right leadership and education focus. You have to orchestrate change across the whole system.
Okay, so adapting forward using the whole DOTML PFEPES framework. What does this look like more concretely? The analysis talks about MDO 2.0.
Right, multi-domain operations, or MDO. The idea is our current force, the first wave that would fight at the start of a major conflict, largely the active component. They'll be experts in our current doctrine. Let's call it MDO 1.0.
Okay, the way we plan to fight right now.
But by the time heavy losses mount up, protraction sets in, and we need to reconstitute forces on a large scale, the enemy will have inevitably started adapting to MDO 1.0. They'll have seen it, fought against it, started developing counters.
Makes sense. So the reconstituted forces, the second wave, can't just be carbon copies using MDO 1.0 again.
That's the argument. The second wave forces the units being regenerated, maybe new units being mobilized. They need to employ a new doctrine, something the enemy hasn't figured out yet. That's what the analysis terms MDO 2.0. It's the next evolution, developed and implemented during the conflict.
What would MDO 2.0 need to be like? It can't be super complicated if you have to teach it quickly to replacements, right? Given that personnel churn we talked about.
Absolutely critical constraint.
Yeah.
MDO 2.0 has to be effective, obviously, but it also has to be rapidly teachable. Given the reality of reconstitution, high turnover, limited time, likely loss of experienced leaders, you simply won't be able to achieve high-level proficiency, say at the brigade or division level, quickly enough with newly formed units.
So where does the focus need to be?
The analysis argues MDO 2.0 must be optimized for the lower echelons, primarily company level and below platoons, squads. That's where you can potentially achieve proficiency relatively quickly, even with new leaders and soldiers. It needs to be simple enough, robust enough, to be executed well by small units under pressure.
Okay, so transformative reconstitution basically envisions two different types of forces working in sequence, each optimized for a different job.
That's a good way to put it. The first wave, built around the active component nucleus, is like the fine-tuned machine. Highly proficient in MDO 1.0, leveraging deep, habitual relationships between units, designed to fight primarily as large, powerful echelons to win quickly or decisively shape the battlefield for what comes next.
They're the initial shock force and the second wave.
The second wave, which would likely rely heavily on the reserve component nucleus, is fundamentally built to out-adapt the adversary. Their focus is mastering and employing MDO 2.0.
And they need different characteristics.
Yes. They need to be comfortable with constant change. Expect frequent task organization, shifts units getting swapped between commands routinely. They need to be okay with more transactional relationships, maybe not having those deep habitual ties the first wave had. Their strength lies in winning through agility with smaller, highly adaptive echelons that can execute MDO 2.0 effectively at the company platoon level.
Why specifically point to the reserve component, the National Guard and Army Reserve, as the core for this adaptive second wave? Why not just build more active units differently?
The analysis makes a compelling case that the reserve component already possesses many of the key attributes needed for this MDO 2.0 adaptive force role.
Like what?
Well, first, their soldiers often bring diverse civilian skills and experiences, which tends to make them inherently more adaptable, maybe better at problem solving with limited resources. They're used to operating outside purely military systems. Second, because they have limited training time each year, the classic 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a summer model, they naturally focus their training efforts on achieving proficiency at lower echelons.
Platoon and company level stuff.
Exactly. Gunnery, basic maneuver, section certifications. They don't typically have the time or resources for large-scale, division-level collective training like the active component does. So their existing training culture is already kind of aligned with where MDO 2.0 needs to be focused. Lower echelon mastery and adaptability.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective on leveraging reserve component strengths differently. So how do we actually implement this? How do we build this MDO 2.0 capability and foster this adaptability now? The analysis points to training, specifically the combat training centers.
Yes, the combat training centers like the National Training Center or the Joint Readiness Training Center are seen as the key lever for changing culture and practice. We need to deliberately train for this transition and adaptation.
What specific changes are needed at the CTCs?
Several things. For instance, when reserve component units conduct rotations that simulate following an active component unit, both forces need to practice those messy transition operations. Realistically, things like passage of lines, handovers of responsibility, planned retirements under pressure.
Make the handoff part of the evaluated mission.
Right. Also, scenario design needs to change. It should reward speed and decisive action during transitions. Maybe if a unit transitions quickly, they face a smaller, less prepared delaying force from the opposing side, simulating seizing a window of opportunity. If they're slow, the enemy gets stronger.
And it needs to be about adaptation, not just validation, right?
Absolutely critical. For rotations that aren't focused solely on validating a unit for deployment, non-mission validating rotations, the CTCs should have the freedom to break the usual mold. Force units into unexpected situations.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, maybe throw a unit into a scenario that is entirely urban, forcing them to adapt tactics away from open desert maneuver. Or deliberately target key leaders early on, forcing the unit to exercise its succession of command plan with less experienced people stepping up. Or present them with an opposing force that's surprisingly large or surprisingly small, forcing them to tear up their initial plan and develop a whole new course of action on the fly.
Stressing their ability to think and adapt, not just follow a script.
Precisely. The goal is to cultivate adaptability as a core competency, not just validate proficiency in the existing MDO 1.0 playbook.
And the final piece of this, institutionally, is giving the reserve component the lead in developing MDO 2.0, making them the proponent.
That's the recommendation. It's a significant policy shift, TP, in DOTMLPFP. It means moving away from the decades-long institutional goal of trying to make reserve component units exact duplicates or slightly less capable copies of active component units.
Let them be different because they have a different role in this model.
Exactly. Transformative reconstitution requires space for experimentation, for developing new ways of fighting. The analysis argues the reserve component's inherent strengths, that adaptability, that lower echelon focus, make them the ideal part of the Army to lead the development and refinement of MDO 2.0 now, in peacetime, rather than trying to invent it under fire during a war. Hashtag out and outro.
Okay, wrapping this up. This deep dive into reconstitution operations, looking at both the doctrine and the lessons from Ukraine, it really exposes a fundamental tension, doesn't it? The U.S. Army, culturally, institutionally, it's built for decisive maneuver warfare.
Right. Win fast, win decisively.
But our current reconstitution doctrine, while better than some, still seems heavily focused on just managing attrition over time, balancing that supply and demand ledger. That feels misaligned.
It's a potential misalignment that the analysis argues needs to be fixed now, before the next major conflict forces our hand.
And this transformative reconstitution concept offers a way forward, a way to potentially gain an asymmetric advantage.
That's the proposal. It aims to transform the force in two key ways. First, it gets the Army thinking about and preparing for protraction and large-scale reconstitution now, making sure that second wave force, built around MDO 2.0, is ready before it's needed.
Proactive preparation.
And second, by designing that second wave to be inherently adaptive, it builds continuous adaptation into the force during the conflict itself. The goal is to completely sidestep that devastating efficacy dilemma, that qualitative decline that we've seen cripple the Russian military.
So the potential seems huge. We have the components active, reserve, great training centers. We have the intellectual capital. What's the biggest hurdle then, according to the analysis, to actually implementing something like this?
In a word, inertia, institutional inertia, the gravitational pull of doing things the way we've always done them.
It's comfortable, it's known.
It is. And transformative reconstitution requires being bold. It requires fundamentally rethinking roles and missions. It means truly abandoning that long-held desire for simple duplication between the active and reserve components. It means accepting that the second wave shouldn't just be a slightly less ready copy of the first, but something different, something potentially better suited for the later stages of a protracted war, more adaptive, more resilient.
So the final thought, the question maybe we should leave everyone mulling over, is this. What deeply ingrained assumptions about your own organization, military or otherwise, would you need to challenge, maybe even discard, to build a force truly designed not just to fight, but to continuously outadapt a determined, thinking adversary? That's the real challenge, isn't it? That's the core question behind adopting transformative reconstitution.